4 years, the whispers stayed hidden, buried in forums, dismissed as rumor, ignored by the mainstream. But something shifted this week. Questions that once lived in the shadows have stepped into the spotlight, and now, for the first time, they're being asked where it matters most. Publicly, permanently, and with consequences that may be impossible to reverse. Something changed, and not in the way these stories usually do. Because this wasn't a leak. It wasn't a tabloid headline. And it definitely wasn't just another YouTube theory being passed around in corners of the internet. This time, it came from somewhere that doesn't usually play in rumors. 4 years, the narrative around Meghan Markle followed a predictable pattern. Stories would surface, questions would be raised, and just as quickly, they would be dismissed, buried, or quietly disappear. Anyone who pushed too hard was labeled, ignored, or pushed to the edges of the conversation. And slowly, that created a kind of invisible boundary, an unspoken rule about what could and could not be discussed. But this week, that boundary broke. And it didn't break loudly. It broke quietly, almost subtly, until people started realizing what had actually happened. Because the shift wasn't about what was said. It was about where it was said. For the first time, questions that had lived for years in speculation were suddenly being acknowledged in a space that carries weight, history, and credibility. Not a gossip blog, not a viral clip, but a publication tied to the very establishment itself. And that's when everything changed. Because when a platform like that decides to even entertain a question, whether directly or indirectly, it sends a signal. Not just to the public, but to other media, to insiders, to people who have been watching quietly for years. It signals permission. Permission to look again. Permission to question. Permission to speak. And once that permission is given, it doesn't stay contained. It spreads. What makes this moment so different isn't just the content of the claims. Those, in one form or another, have existed for a long time. People have talked. Screenshots have circulated. Connections have been speculated on. But it always stayed fragmented, pieces of a puzzle that never fully came together. Until now. Because now, those same fragments are being reframed, not as isolated rumors, but as part of a larger picture that people are starting to examine more seriously. And suddenly, details that once seemed disconnected are being revisited. Social circles. Old associations. Moments from the past that didn't make sense at the time, but now feel different when viewed through a new lens. It's no longer about one claim. It's about patterns. And patterns are much harder to ignore. At the same time, something else has been happening in the background. Something that, on its own, might not have raised alarms. But combined with everything else, starts to feel significant. Because while these questions are resurfacing publicly, behind the scenes, there are signs of strain. Professional relationships that once looked strong, beginning to crack. Partnerships that once seemed secure, suddenly uncertain. And an image that was carefully built over years, starting to show signs of pressure. Individually, each of these moments could be explained away. But together, they tell a different story. A story of momentum shifting. And what makes it even more complicated is timing. Because all of this isn't unfolding slowly over months or years. It's happening all at once. Questions resurfacing. Media tone changing. Industry whispers getting louder. And public perception starting to shift in real time. That kind of convergence doesn't happen by accident. It happens when something underneath the surface has been building for a long time, and finally reaches a point where it can't stay contained anymore. And here's the part that makes this moment so difficult to navigate. It's not about proving anything, at least not yet. It's about attention. Because once attention shifts, once people start looking in a different direction, asking different questions, connecting different dots, it creates a momentum that's incredibly hard to stop. And historically, when that kind of momentum begins, it doesn't reverse. It escalates. More voices join in. More information surfaces. More people, who were previously silent, start to speak. Not necessarily because they want to, but because the environment has changed enough that they can. And that's where this story is now. Right at that edge. Between what was once controlled, and what is starting to slip beyond control. Because for a long time, the narrative was managed, carefully shaped, carefully presented, carefully defended. But now, the narrative isn't just coming from one place anymore. It's coming from multiple directions at once. And when that happens, it becomes much harder to contain. What we're witnessing isn't a conclusion. It's the beginning of something unfolding. Something that's no longer confined to speculation, but hasn't yet reached full clarity either. And that space in between. That's where the tension lives. Because people aren't just watching anymore. They're waiting. Waiting to see what comes next. And just as that shift began to settle in, another layer quietly surfaced. Because what happens when attention moves is predictable. But what happens next is where things get uncomfortable. Once a question enters the mainstream, even cautiously, it doesn't stay isolated. It creates a ripple. Other outlets begin to notice. Commentators who once stayed silent start testing the waters. And people who were previously dismissed suddenly find themselves being reconsidered. Not validated, not confirmed, but no longer ignored. And that alone changes everything. Because for years, one of the strongest shields in this entire situation was disbelief. The idea that certain topics were simply too controversial, too unverified, too risky to even touch publicly. That shield worked, until now. Now, that shield has cracks. And through those cracks, something else is starting to emerge: context. Because when you step back and look at the broader picture, the conversation is no longer just about isolated claims. It's about connections that people are beginning to revisit more seriously than before. Connections that once seemed coincidental. Circles that overlapped in ways that weren't questioned at the time. And moments that didn't raise eyebrows then, but feel different now. And one of the most discussed elements quietly re-entering the conversation is proximity. Not direct involvement. Not proven links. But proximity. Who was in the same spaces? Who knew the same people? Who moved within similar social circles at a time when those circles carried influence, power, and, in some cases, controversy? Because proximity doesn't prove anything on its own, but it raises questions. And right now, questions are exactly what's gaining traction. At the same time, there's another detail that's becoming harder to ignore, something that has lingered in the background for years but is now being looked at with fresh eyes. The idea that certain parts of the past were quietly cleaned up, not erased completely, but reduced, minimized, made harder to find. And whether that was intentional or simply a result of rising public profiles, people are now asking a different kind of question. Not just what happened, but why certain things are so difficult to trace back clearly. Because in the digital age, very little disappears without a reason. And when gaps appear, they tend to draw attention. Especially now. Because this isn't happening in isolation anymore. While these older questions are resurfacing, something else is unfolding in real time, and it's adding pressure from an entirely different direction. Professional credibility. Because behind the scenes, reports have started to paint a picture that doesn't fully align with the public image that was once presented so confidently. Stories of strained working relationships, of difficult interactions, of a pattern that, whether fair or not, is beginning to repeat across different platforms and partnerships. And here's where it becomes significant. Because when similar descriptions start emerging from unrelated sources, people start to notice patterns again. And patterns, once established, become narratives. Narratives that are much harder to reverse than a single headline or rumor. What's even more telling is the response, or, in some cases, the lack of one. Because typically, when stories like this begin to circulate, there's a pushback, a clarification, a strong denial. But when the reaction is quieter, more measured, or delayed, it creates space. And in that space, speculation grows. Not because it's confirmed, but because it's unanswered. And that's the environment we're seeing now. A situation where multiple threads, past questions, present tensions, shifting media tone, are all starting to converge. Individually, each one might not carry enough weight. But together, they start to feel like something bigger. Something that's no longer easy to dismiss as coincidence. And perhaps the most important detail in all of this is timing. Because none of this is happening in a vacuum. The media landscape has changed. Audience expectations have changed. And the threshold for what can be discussed publicly has shifted. Which means stories that once would have been avoided entirely are now being approached, carefully, strategically, but noticeably. And once that door opens, it rarely closes again. Because attention, once redirected, tends to stay there. Digging deeper. Looking closer. Asking more. And that's exactly what we're seeing begin. This isn't a moment where everything is suddenly revealed. It's a moment where the process begins. Where the conversation expands beyond controlled narratives and enters a space that's far less predictable. A space where multiple voices contribute. Where new details can surface at any time. And where the direction of the story is no longer controlled by a single perspective. And that's what makes this phase so critical. Because once a story reaches this point, it doesn't slow down. It accelerates. More scrutiny. More attention. More pressure, until eventually something gives. The only question now is what that something will be. And just as the pressure from those resurfacing questions began to build, another front opened, one that had nothing to do with the past and everything to do with the present. Because while attention was turning backward, examining old connections and unanswered questions, something else was happening in real time. And this part couldn't be dismissed as rumor. It was being reported. Carefully. Strategically. But unmistakably. Because when industry insiders begin speaking, even anonymously, it signals something very different from speculation. It suggests that whatever is happening behind the scenes has reached a point where silence is no longer sustainable. And that's exactly what started to emerge. A picture, not explosive, not dramatic, but consistent. Consistently difficult interactions. Consistently strained communication. Consistently growing frustration within professional environments that are usually built on diplomacy and discretion. And here's what makes that significant. In industries like entertainment and media, reputations aren't destroyed overnight. They erode slowly, quietly, through repeated experiences that begin to form a pattern over time. And once that pattern becomes recognizable, it spreads, not publicly at first, but internally, between executives, between producers, between decision-makers who rely on trust, reliability, and predictability, because in those spaces, perception is everything. And what started as isolated reports began to align in a way that was hard to ignore. Stories of meetings that didn't go as expected, of conversations that ended abruptly, of moments where collaboration, something that should have been seamless, became complicated. None of it dramatic enough on its own, but together, enough to raise concern. And then came something even more telling, not just what was said, but what was implied. A shift in tone. Because when organizations begin to distance themselves, they rarely announce it directly. They do it subtly. Fewer visible associations. Less public support. A gradual step back that, to the outside world, might seem insignificant, until you look closely. And when you do, you start to notice what's missing. And absence can speak louder than presence. At the same time, numbers, quietly sitting in the background, began to tell their own story. Performance expectations. Output versus investment. Engagement versus projection. Because in the end, no matter how strong a public image may be, industries operate on results. And when expectations aren't met repeatedly, patience begins to wear thin. Not immediately, but steadily, until it reaches a point where decisions have to be made, not based on perception, but on practicality. And that's where things begin to shift. Because once those decisions start being considered, the dynamic changes completely. What was once seen as a long-term collaboration becomes uncertain. What was once framed as a partnership becomes conditional. And what was once protected becomes exposed to scrutiny. And here's where the convergence becomes impossible to ignore. Because while all of this is unfolding professionally, those earlier questions, the ones that resurfaced, haven't gone away. They're still there, lingering, growing, now amplified by the fact that the protective environment around them appears to be weakening. And when those two forces meet, past scrutiny and present instability, it creates a very specific kind of pressure. The kind that builds quickly. Because it's no longer just about what happened before. It's about how what's happening now affects how people interpret the past. And perception, once it starts shifting in multiple directions at once, becomes incredibly difficult to stabilize. What makes this moment even more complex is that there's no single event driving it. No one headline. No one revelation. No one turning point. Instead, it's a series of smaller shifts, each one subtle on its own, but together forming something much larger. A gradual realignment of media tone, of industry perception, of public curiosity. And once that alignment begins, it creates momentum. Momentum that doesn't rely on any one source, because it feeds itself. One story leads to another. One report raises new questions. One detail makes people look back at everything else differently. And that's exactly what's happening now. A situation where every new piece of information, no matter how small, adds to a growing sense that something bigger is unfolding beneath the surface. Something that isn't fully visible yet, but is becoming harder to ignore. And perhaps the most important detail in all of this is control. Or rather, the loss of it. Because for a long time, the narrative, both public and private, was managed carefully. Responses were measured. Appearances were controlled. The image remained consistent. But now, that control is being challenged. Not directly, but gradually, through multiple sources, multiple perspectives, multiple points of pressure. And when control starts to slip, not all at once, but piece by piece, it creates uncertainty. And uncertainty invites attention. The kind of attention that doesn't just watch, but questions. And once questioning becomes the dominant response, everything changes. Because at that point, it's no longer about maintaining an image. It's about sustaining credibility. And those are two very different battles. Right now, both are being tested. At the same time. From different directions. And that's what makes this moment so unstable. Because when pressure builds across multiple fronts simultaneously, it doesn't just challenge a narrative. It threatens to reshape it entirely. And the deeper this goes, the harder it becomes to predict where it ends. And just when it seemed like the situation couldn't become more complex, another layer began to take shape, one that shifted the focus from perception to consequence. Because there comes a point in any unfolding story where speculation, pressure, and narrative shifts stop being abstract and start becoming real. Not in theory, not in discussion, but in outcomes. And that's the phase this has now entered. Because while the public conversation continues to evolve, behind the scenes, decisions don't wait. They move quietly, deliberately, and often without announcement, until the effects become visible. And those effects are starting to surface. What once looked like a stable structure, carefully built over time through partnerships, positioning, and public identity, is now showing signs of fragmentation. Not collapse. Not yet. But movement. Pieces shifting. Because in environments where reputation and reliability are currency, uncertainty creates hesitation. And hesitation, over time, leads to distance. Not dramatic exits. Not public confrontations. Just distance. Fewer commitments. Less visibility. A noticeable absence of the kind of backing that once seemed guaranteed. And when that backing begins to fade, even slightly, it forces a recalibration. Because suddenly, the position that once felt secure doesn't feel quite as stable. And that's when the pressure changes form. It becomes internal. Because maintaining an image under scrutiny is one thing. Maintaining it while simultaneously navigating professional uncertainty, public questioning, and shifting alliances is something else entirely. And this is where timing becomes critical again. Because all of this is happening simultaneously. Not in stages. Not in isolation. But all at once. And that creates a kind of compression, where multiple pressures stack on top of each other, amplifying the overall impact. The resurfacing questions from the past. The shifting tone in media coverage. The growing whispers within professional circles. And now, the early signs of tangible consequences. Individually manageable. Together, much harder to contain. Because when consequences begin to align with narrative shifts, it reinforces perception. And perception, once reinforced, becomes belief. Not necessarily proven. Not necessarily accurate. But powerful. Because belief influences how every new piece of information is interpreted. And right now, that interpretation is changing. Details that might have once been dismissed are now being examined more closely. Actions that might have once gone unnoticed are now being analyzed. And responses, or the absence of them, are being read in entirely new ways. Because the context has changed. And when context changes, meaning changes with it. What makes this moment even more fragile is the absence of clarity. Because despite everything that's unfolding, there hasn't been a single definitive moment. No clear resolution. No direct confrontation. Just accumulation. Of pressure. Of questions. Of shifting perception. And that kind of accumulation creates instability. Because it leaves room for interpretation. And interpretation, especially in a high-profile situation, can move faster than facts. That's when narratives begin to take shape on their own. Not controlled. Not guided. But driven by momentum. And momentum, once established, is incredibly difficult to reverse. Because it doesn't rely on one source. It builds through repetition. Through consistency. Through the feeling that something is changing, even if the full picture isn't visible yet. And that feeling is exactly what's taking hold now. A growing sense that what's happening isn't just a temporary phase, but part of a larger shift. A shift in how the story is being told, in who is telling it, and in how it's being received. Because for a long time, the narrative moved in one direction. Predictable, structured, controlled. But now, it's moving in multiple directions at once. And that lack of direction creates unpredictability. Because when multiple forces begin pulling at the same time, public opinion, media framing, professional dynamics, the outcome becomes harder to anticipate. And that's where uncertainty turns into risk. Because in situations like this, it's not always the biggest event that changes everything. Sometimes, it's the accumulation of smaller moments reaching a tipping point. A point where the balance shifts. Where what once held steady no longer does. And the signs of that shift are already beginning to appear. Subtle, but undeniable. Because when structures begin to strain, they don't break immediately. They adjust. They bend. They try to hold. Until eventually, something gives. And right now, that's the question hanging over everything. Not whether pressure exists, but how much more can be absorbed before it turns into something irreversible. Because once that line is crossed, there's no going back to how things were. Only forward, into whatever comes next. And now, everything converges. Because what started as quiet questions turned into visible pressure. What looked like isolated moments revealed a pattern. And what once felt controlled is now moving in ways that are no longer predictable. This is the stage where stories stop being managed and start unfolding on their own. Because at this point, it's no longer about one issue, one headline, or one narrative. It's about accumulation reaching a tipping point. And when that happens, things don't slow down. They accelerate. Because look at where everything stands right now. The past, no longer buried, has re-entered the conversation in a way that can't be dismissed as easily as before. The present, through professional strain and shifting industry tone, is creating real-time pressure. And the future, once carefully mapped out, now looks uncertain, with fewer guarantees and more variables than ever. All three timelines colliding at once. And that kind of convergence is rare. Because usually, when pressure builds, it comes in waves. One issue rises, peaks, and fades before the next begins. But this is different. Everything is happening simultaneously. And that creates something far more difficult to navigate, because there's no clear direction to respond to. Do you address the past? Do you stabilize the present? Or do you try to secure the future before it shifts even further? Because each move comes with risk. Addressing one area might amplify another. Ignoring one issue might allow it to grow. And staying silent, while sometimes strategic, can also be interpreted in ways that are impossible to control. And that's where the real tension lies. Not just in what is happening, but in what happens next. Because this stage isn't about revelation. It's about reaction. How situations are handled. How narratives are responded to. How pressure is managed when it's coming from multiple directions at once. And history shows something very clear. Moments like this define outcomes. Not the rumors. Not the speculation. But the response. Because when everything is uncertain, people don't just watch events. They watch behavior. They watch how someone adapts. How they respond under pressure. How they navigate a situation where control is no longer absolute. And those observations shape perception more than anything else. Which brings us to the most important point. This isn't the end of the story. It's the point where the story truly begins to reveal itself. Because everything up until now, every question, every report, every shift, has been building toward this phase. The phase where outcomes start forming. Where consequences, whether immediate or delayed, begin to take shape. And where the direction of everything becomes clearer. Not through what's said, but through what unfolds. Because once momentum reaches this level, it doesn't disappear. It either stabilizes or escalates. And right now, there's no clear sign of it slowing down. If anything, the pace is increasing. More attention. More scrutiny. More people looking closer than they ever have before. And that creates a situation where every next step matters more than the last. Because one decision, one response, one unexpected development can shift everything. That's the reality of this moment. Unstable, unpredictable, and still evolving. And perhaps the most telling detail of all? No one is looking away anymore. Not the media, not the industry, and certainly not the public. Because once attention locks in at this level, it stays. Watching, waiting, analyzing, until something, finally, breaks the uncertainty. And when that moment comes, it won't just answer questions. It will redefine the entire narrative. So now the question turns to you. After everything that's unfolding, after the shift we're witnessing in real time, what do you think happens next? Because this story isn't finished. Not even close. And if you've been following closely, you already know. The most important part is still coming. If you want to stay ahead of every twist, every development, and every hidden layer as this unfolds, make sure you're subscribed, because what comes next could change everything.